Today, this afternoon, we will be hearing from Troy LaRaviere. I got it right, yes. Troy LaRaviere is the president of the Chicago Principals and Administrators Association. He has been a Chicago Public Schools student, a Chicago Public Schools principal, and he's currently the parent of a Chicago Public Schools student. Amen. Troy led the highest performing neighborhood school in Chicago by the name of Blaine, and he relentlessly defended public education and continues to defend so. Mr. LaRaviere's school was one of the only 5 out of more than 600, and the bio and the iPad turned off on me, and it died, of course. So I'm just gonna tell you what I know about him without going through all of this. So Troy LaRaviere had one of the most successful schools, and he led this school and made sure that there was a turnaround in that school within the next 2 years. From a scoring of about 70%, within 2 years, the school had succeeded to have more than 89% success rate. Troy LaRaviere is from Chicago. He has been hardworking at public education and has not been afraid to call out injustice, even if it's in confronting Pharaoh that looks like a mayor, a city council person. As a consequence of him speaking truth to power, Chicago Public Schools decided to come after him, and to a point that in 2016, they removed them from his school. Now, we know that we are people of power, and Troy decided, that's fine, you can remove me from the school, but I will continue to fight for justice and for public education in the city of Chicago, in such way that in 2016, he also became the president of the Principals Association out there in Chicago, against the will and all the powers that be in the city of Chicago, one of the most corrupt cities. Troy LaRaviere has been building and speaking against injustice for a long, long time, his entire life. And he has seen that education and relationship building has made the whole difference. And so today, from Chicago, from where Barack Obama continues to be our president, I would like to introduce to you, I would love to introduce to you Troy LaRaviere.
Good afternoon, beautiful people. We're having some technical difficulties. I told him I like to walk when I talk. I'm not a podium kind of man, but this thing isn't on yet, so I'm gonna stay here. Hopefully it'll be on at some point and I can start moving. I wish I could tell you all the story, the background of that introduction that Delia gave, because there was a higher power working in my life in that story. Now I can move? All right, cool. Gotta hold this though. There was a higher power moving in my life in that story. I think I left my clicker up there. But I'll say that for another day. What I'm here to talk about today is the foundation for bridge building between the so-called races. And so, let's get to it. Here's a quick overview of what I'm going to try to get across today. First, I'm going to give some context and history to this concept of race. Then I'm going to tell some stories in my own life that we're going to call police stories. I'm not going to tell all of those, just about 2 or 3, maybe 4. Then I'll tell some school stories, all having to do with race. Then I'm going to try and bring it back and wrap it up to talk about how those stories relate to each and every person in this room, including myself. All right? All right. So, race is a relatively new concept in human history. If I were to draw a line from that wall to that wall, and that whole line represents the timeline of human history, the idea of race would have been present in about that much of that line. We have not always called ourselves and identified ourselves as black or white. It's relatively new. How did that come about? So in the mid-1600s, in the English colonies here in America, you might be surprised that at least in the early 1600s, one, the concept didn't exist. And black people who were, well, I was about to say black, but black didn't exist then. People who came from Africa, who were brought here from Africa, and people who were brought here from Europe, who were poor, worked side by side under the same miserable conditions as indentured servants, served 7 to 9 years, then got out and some were able to get some land of their own. Some of you might be shocked to learn that some of those African indentured servants got land and then brought in European indentured servants to work for them. Who knew that? But for the most part, those Africans and those poor Europeans worked side by side in the same miserable conditions. They worked together, they played together, they married each other, they ran away together, they robbed the master of his labor together. And they rebelled together. And it was one rebellion that changed the course of history, Bacon's Rebellion, where the poor Europeans and the poor Africans came together and united to rebel and overthrow their colonial masters. And that did it. That created a situation where they felt like they needed to divide these poor Europeans and these poor Africans. And that was when they began the onset of race-based slavery. No, you're not a poor European or Irishman. You're white like me. And they're black. Right? To try and get people who were poor Europeans to identify more with the masters who exploited them than with the people who they were being exploited beside. Am I making sense here? Okay. Now, at the end of slavery, many of the institutions like segregation and Jim Crow that we know didn't exist. When slavery ended, there was no Jim Crow. In fact, the leaders of the populist movement were uniting poor blacks, the concept existed at that point, and poor whites to basically serve as a voting bloc that would drive the masters out of power. Am I making sense here? And so the masters got to work. And I have never seen this articulated better than by Martin Luther King Jr. at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March. Who knows what I'm talking about? Okay, if you don't, I'm going to read the most important segment of that speech to you. You all ready? I love that picture, Dr. King. It's like I don't take no stuff. This is what he said: racial segregation as a way of life did not come about as a natural result of hatred between the races immediately after the Civil War. There were no laws segregating the races then. The segregation of the races was really a political stratagem employed by the emerging bourbon interest in the South to keep the Southern masses divided and Southern labor cheapest in the land. Toward the end of the Reconstruction era, something very significant happened. The leaders of the populist movement began awakening the poor white masses and the former Negro slaves to the fact that they were both being fleeced by the emerging bourbon interests. Not only that, but they began uniting the Negro and white masses into a voting bloc that threatened to drive the bourbon interests from the command post of political power in the South. To meet this threat, I've listened to this speech many times, so I find myself taking on his cadence. To meet this threat, the Southern aristocracy began immediately to engineer this development of a segregated society. I want you to follow me here, because this is very important to see the roots of racism. Through their control of the mass media, they revised the doctrine of white supremacy.
They saturated the thinking of the poor white masses with it, thus clouding their minds to the real issues. Sound familiar? They saturated the thinking of the poor white masses with it, thus clouding their minds to the real issues. Then they directed the placement on the books of the South of laws that made it a crime for Negroes and whites to come together as equals at any level. And that did it. They crippled and eventually destroyed the populist movement of the 19th century. If it may be said of the slavery era that the white man took the world and gave the Negro Jesus, then it may be said of the Reconstruction era that the Southern aristocracy took the world and gave the poor white man Jim Crow. And when his wrinkled stomach cried out for the food that his empty pockets could not provide, he ate Jim Crow, a psychological bird that told him that no matter how bad off he was, at least he was a white man, better than the black man. And he ate Jim Crow. And when his undernourished children cried out for the necessities that his low wages could not provide, he showed them the Jim Crow signs on the buses and in the stores and on the streets and in the public buildings. And his children, too, learned to feed upon Jim Crow, their last outpost of psychological oblivion. Does that sound familiar? I think this one's working now. Now, I want to look at a modern day manifestation of that, then I'm going to go back. One of the things my association just did was we did an analysis of special education funding in CPS. They underfunded Chicago public schools across the board and then gave schools a chance to appeal for more funding. When we did an analysis of the data that was forced out through a Freedom of Information Act request, this is what we found. If you were a school that served majority white students, you got 60% of what you asked for. If you were a school that served majority Hispanic students, you got 14% of what you asked for. And if you were a school that served majority black students, you got just 9% of what you asked for. Now, the average person, justifiably so, would look at that and focus on the difference. And you should focus on the difference. And you would want to address that difference. That's unfair. But what most folk miss here, and this is the purpose of racism, for you to miss this, is that nobody got everything they wanted. Nobody got everything their children needed. That is the function of racism, to make one group believe that they're ahead when they're getting fleeced like everybody else. The last outpost of psychological oblivion, still right here today. Is everybody understanding me? Now let's go back. So you can enslave an entire group of people, millions of them, and hold them in bondage under brutal conditions unless you get buy-in from the general public. The public won't accept something that doesn't fit right with their sense of morality. Everybody wants to believe they're doing the right thing. And so if you're going to enslave them for several hundred years, you have to create ideas. Listen to me. You have to create and promote and disseminate ideas about these people that make you feel like it's okay to do it to them. They're different. They're less intelligent. They're less ethical. They're less honest. They're less civilized. You have to create some doubt about the capacity of a black intellect. You have to create some questioning about the mores and values of a black heart. You have to make people question the significance of the words coming from a black voice. And if you're successful in that, you can get public buy-in to the brutality that you want to instigate or implement or execute against this group of people. You all understanding me? You can't 100 years later say, okay, they're free now, but we're going to segregate them. We're going to brutalize them. We're going to lynch them. We're going to put them in schools that are underfunded unless you keep up these ideas about them. Unless you push these negative beliefs to the general public about them, and also push those ideas on those black people themselves. They have to accept it. Now, when you end slavery and you end segregation, did you end those ideas? Those ideas are what we today come to know as prejudices. I want y'all to remember that word, prejudice. All of those negative ideas that they created about the people they wanted to subjugate didn't disappear. They remained in the culture, in the dominant group and the non-dominant group. You all hearing me? Okay? And so one of the things I want you all to take away from this, though, is that prejudice is not an evil. Prejudice is an illness. Prejudice is not an evil. Prejudice is an illness. Now, I'm going to talk later on in the end about why that's so important. Because we have to fight evil. And we have to fight prejudice, and you fight evil one way and you fight an illness another. And if you misidentify, you're going to execute the wrong strategy. It's an illness, not an evil. Let me get back to that later. In the meantime, I'm going to tell some police stories. 1987. We have to see these concepts in life. And so all the concepts that I just talked about, particularly the concept of prejudice, I'll tell you real stories from my life. 1987, I am a senior at Dunbar Vocational High School in Chicago, Illinois. I've been socially awkward and reclusive my entire life. I'm sort of coming out now. I think I'm cute. I got a crew I'm hanging out with. One of them has a car. So we rolling on Friday night to the Rainbow Roller Rink on the north side of Chicago. Now, if you're not from Chicago, I'm a south side. South side is identified with black people. The north side is identified with white people. The rainbow is on the north side. So we're rolling. We think we're doing all right. Car starts following us. Everywhere we turn, it turned. And my boy Lucius was driving. And I don't know what Lou was thinking, but he turned down a residential street and stopped. And so this car pulls up behind us, and it stops. Guy gets out the car, pulls out a gun. I usually say verbatim, but I'm in a religious community today, what this man said. Get out the car. We get out, and I remember I'm on the back of the car like this, and I'll never forget looking over at this guy like this, and he put that gun right in my face. Turn your head around before I blow it off. I turned my head back. What are you all doing here? Where are you from? We tell them where we from. We going to the Rainbow. We just trying to have a good time, like any other group of teenagers. And he tells us, I would tell the rest of it, but I need to get ahead. So he basically tells us he better not ever see us in that community again. And he sends us off on our way. Next story. Now, this man, before I get to the next story, this man had some ideas about, this is a police officer. He's plain clothes. He has some ideas about the kids. He saw a cop. He had some ideas about the intentions of the hearts in that car. Once he saw our skin, his conditioning, his illness, his sickness, everything he had been taught by the society he grew up in kicked in. When I see that, I've been taught to question their intentions, question their morality, question their ethics. In his mind, he's not a racist. He's just responding to a gut feeling. That gut feeling is not a gut feeling, it's a sickness. The driveway. Every time I'm thinking about the story now and how I'm going to edit my normal, because this one's pretty rough. So I'm coming home with my girlfriend. We want to pull into her driveway. She's on Claremont Street. My grandparents live across the street from her. And cops are everywhere. We can't get into the driveway. Nothing's going on. The cops are just hanging out, talking. There was something earlier, but it's over, whatever it was. And they won't move. And I was a hothead, I admit. So I get out, my little brother, Sean, who's also a public school principal now, comes over, because he knows I'm a hothead. Troy, what's going on, man? What's going on? Come on over here. And I'm like, these won't move their car. I was in the wrong. I shouldn't have used that language. The head cop with the white shirt, arrest him. We ain't have to take this. So they, lock me up, put me in cuffs, take me to the station. And I'm sitting there. And as they were arresting me, there was this one cop. You remember, was it NYPD Blue, the little guy that looked like Danny DeVito? All right, there was one who looked just like him. He's got his baton, because I'm like, they got me like this, and I'm like, what's the charges? What are you arresting me for? And I'm kind of stiffing up, but I'm not, really resisting. He's like, come on, go ahead, come on. He just wants to hit me. So he didn't hit me. And this same guy is doing the paperwork when I get to the station. And he says, Troy, you people have no respect for the law. And this is around Rodney King time, like a month or so after. And I'm like, you all have no respect for us. And I start citing Rodney King, and I start talking about, police brutality. And he realizes I'm not the normal kind of teenager he comes in. I'm like 20 at this point. Young guy he comes in contact to. He says, oh, you're one of those revolutionaries. And I'm like, just because I know a little something, I gotta be a revolutionary. He says, oh, you're one of those people who want a revolution. Mm-hmm. Well, you know what, Troy? I want a revolution too. I want you guys to have your revolution because I can't wait until it happens, because that's the day I'm going to shoot every one of you down. I go, Now, he has some ideas too about who I am. Right? Apparently, he puts black people in one or two categories. And you can't win either way. You either the thug on the street, or if you got some intelligence, you're a revolutionary who wants to take over America. So that's story number 2. Story number 3 was one of the most amazing ones. I'm an assistant principal. I'm in my late 30s. I'm rushing home. I must admit, I was speeding. And I'm going through a yellow light or two that might not have been yellow. And I'm going. Yeah, I went through some orange lights. And I noticed this car that's zooming past me. And he zooms past me. It's a truck, an unmarked truck. He stops it in front of me so that I can't move, gets out. He's yelling, he gets in, he flashes his badge, he reaches into my car, grabs my keys, throws him to the ground, and then puts his hand on his gun. And I look, and I don't know what got into me, but first I looked, I'm like, a gun? Really? A gun? That's what I'm saying, a gun? For a traffic stop? And then it like shook him. He kind of like stopped. And then he just started lighting into me about my driving. He's just going at it, cursing me out. And I'm looking at the cars behind us stacking up in the traffic. And I have an extra key right here. I said, officer, if it's okay with you, can I just pull a car up over there so these people can get past me, past us? And he stopped like a marionette. And he said, you're not who I thought you were. And he acknowledged, he noticed, he said something about the suit I had on, that I was trying to be cordial and considerate. And he gave me my keys, and he was just kind of shook up, and he let me go on my way. This officer had some ideas about who I was supposed to be, who he had been taught to believe that someone who looked like me was a certain way. Am I making sense here? And there was something in that interaction where he just stopped and realized I wasn't who he had been conditioned to believe I was. Am I making sense here? I've been told my time is getting short, so I got to keep going. I'm going to have to skip the door. Maybe I'll tell that one later. I'm going to talk about the orchestra. Why am I talking about an orchestra? So, the orchestra story is as following. In orchestra's tryouts, it was found that women were not making it to the finals and getting positions as musicians in orchestras. And people wondered if it might be a prejudice, a bias against women. And so they began to have blind tryouts. And so they put these screens up. And then they would have them play behind the screens. And at first, there was no difference. Women were still not making it to the finals. And then during an audition, someone noticed the sound of a clicking heel. And so they began to tell women to take their shoes off before they auditioned. And the rates with which women were then forwarded to the finals and ultimately given positions skyrocketed. Now, these are highly trained musicians who are judging this, right? Music is their life, and yet the sound of a clicking heel and the identification of that sound with the gender of the female gender impaired the professional judgment of highly trained musicians. The bias was more powerful than their training. And so I have this question for you. If the ingrained cultural prejudice against women is so powerful that a trigger as subtle as the sound of a high-heeled shoe can heavily influence the judgment of a highly trained musician, then when you consider the power and ingrained cultural prejudice against black people, how much influence will the trigger of the sight of a black body have on the judgment of a poorly trained police officer? Cultural prejudice is powerful. But I got something you all are not going to want to hear. I got a lot here. I have to forward through a bunch of things. I'm going to forward through this whole thing. I was supposed to talk about education. And maybe during question and answer, I can come back to this. I'm going to forward through all of that. I want to talk about what prejudice is and what racism is. Prejudice is the beliefs. Racism is acting on those beliefs. Prejudice are the beliefs you have about people without knowing a person because of the group that he or she belongs to before you even have met this person. That's a prejudice. Prejudge. Prejudice is prejudge. Like you think you know beforehand based on these biases that you've been taught to have. Racism is acting on those beliefs. So let me say this. Oh, I wish I could tell that story. No, I have to tell the story. I'm just going to have to fight me for a little more time. So prejudices are also held by the people whom are being oppressed. I have a brother-in-law. His name is Joe Moore. He inherited his father's business when he was 16 years old after his father died, Moore's Movers. And he handled that business so professionally. He was unlike any teenager I'd ever met in my life. He was like an old man, wise, professional, kept his trucks in immaculate condition, always pristine. But he would never tell his clients he owned the business because he understood how he was perceived as a young black man. He would always say, yeah, I'll let Mr. Moore know. I'll never forget one day when he picked me up from my grandparents' house on that block of Claremont Street, because I try to work with him as much as I could. And he was such an influence on me. He was maybe about 20 around this time, maybe 19 or 20. He picks me up in his rig, and we going down this residential street. And Raymond, a guy who lived down the street, stops the truck because he saw me get in. And he starts a conversation up with my brother-in-law. And Raymond goes, what white man you work for? And this is a black man, Raymond. What white man you work for? And Joe was like, oh man, how you know I work for a white man? What gave it away? Raymond looks at him and says, shoot, man, this truck got a brand new paint job. Ain't no nigga got no truck like this. Excuse my language, but that's what he said. The prejudices are in us. The prejudices are against black people are in black people. The prejudices against Hispanic people are in Hispanic people. Do we understand this? This is extremely important. I'm getting to the conclusion. It's extremely important that you accept that. Now, many of us recognize those prejudices. And that's the key. The key to stopping racism, because remember, racism is acting on a prejudice. If you know it's in you, you can check yourself. If you know it's in you, you can check yourself. I'll never forget, I was called, this was pretty recently, it was a Latino principal who was being accused of being prejudiced against Latino, Spanish-speaking people in his school, and I came to mediate the conflict. And you know, and the ones who were Spanish-speaking felt like he disrespected them. And so I'm sitting here listening to everybody. This side, that side, this side. And there are people who speak fluent English and those who don't. And I noticed as I'm listening to them that I had to ask the ones who were not native speakers to repeat themselves a couple times. And I didn't admit this publicly, but I admitted it to myself. I realized that I wasn't listening as closely to those who spoke Spanish and needed a translator. And so I told myself that I'm going to listen to the degree that I'm going to repeat what she said. I'm going to make myself repeat what you said so that I can make sure I guard against that prejudices that not only I have, that we all have been taught to have. You can't live in America and not be impacted by this. It's an illness and we are all afflicted. But we don't all have to succumb to it. Remember, we all prejudiced, but we don't all have to be racist. Because you can acknowledge that prejudice and then commit yourself not to act on it, but you can't commit yourself not to act on it if you don't acknowledge it. That's step number one. And that's why prejudice as illness and not evil is so important. Because when we began to talk to each other about dealing with our prejudices, people get defensive. Nobody wants to be called racist or prejudiced because that's an evil. We have to reframe how we talk about racism and prejudice. It is an illness. And one of the most important things that I did up here to try and get you to acknowledge what might be your prejudices is to acknowledge my own. Those are two things that I did up here. Like, I am that officer. He's not evil, he's ill. I'm that officer. I'm that audition judge. I'm that reporter. I'm that policy consultant. The same illness that afflicts them afflicts me. But I don't have to suck. It's like Alcoholics Anonymous. What's the first step? You have to get up and say, I am an alcoholic. If you can't take that step, you can't take any of the other steps that are supposed to come after it. And so so my number one job, I tried to find one where I was like this, but this is as close as I have, is to look at myself, to look in the mirror. If I want to fight racism and prejudice, my number one job is to look in the mirror, to find it in myself and commit to killing it, to addressing it, to stomping it out in myself. Because if I can't do that, how can I tell this system I'm fighting to do it if I can't do it to myself? And so in institutions like this, in this church, you all fight injustice. I heard this might be an issue. You all are committed to fighting injustice. If you are committed to fighting injustice as an institution, the first thing you have to do is acknowledge its existence within your own institution. But those of you who are clapping, stop. Stop. Because I modeled something for you, because you want to see it. If you want to see it, you have to acknowledge those 2 points that I just made. You can't address it in a way that's going to make people defensive. You can't attack people. You have to learn the lesson that I just tried to teach you. Acknowledge that we all have it, including you. And acknowledge it as an illness, not an evil. And that way the person you're trying to get to address it within themselves will be a bit more open to it. Am I making sense here? We have to create the kind of climate that will allow us to create this system within our organizations to fight that injustice, so that we then create a model for showing the government and the other institutions that we work with for fighting that injustice. Am I making sense here? It's like you are creating the template within that you want people to implement without. Am I making sense? All right. I think I probably surpassed my time. So I think I'm just going to open it up for a question or two and let it go. That's all I got.